So I would like to welcome everyone here. This is the second of the ECPN series, and my name is Kathleen Kummen, and I am one of the co-directors of the Early Childhood Pedagogy Network. I am joining you today from Treaty 3 territory, which is the traditional and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, and Dakota nations. Treaty 3 is also home to many Métis people. I offer up this land acknowledgement to express my deep gratitude as an uninvited guest on these lands and to honor the land's current and ancestral keepers. My hope that is in acknowledging the land, I will make visible the ongoing acts of resilience and resistance enacted on Treaty 3 lands. I celebrate and honor the resistance that has led to the recent celebrations marking the end of a boil water advisory that existed for decades in the Shoal Nation after they were able to create the Freedom Road. I acknowledge the resilience of the people of the Grassy Narrows Nation, of which 90% of the community suffer from mercury poison. I share this information so that as we engage today, thinking about curriculum, we do so remembering that we live on lands where there are ongoing acts of systemic racism and state-sanctioned violence. I also offer this land acknowledgement to remind myself and you that our pedagogical conversations can never be outside of the current narratives of exclusion and erasure in early childhood education. The Early Childhood Pedagogy Network is committed to acknowledging that education is a political project capable of great violence, as evident in residential schools. But we also believe, alongside bell hooks, that education holds the potential of creating paradise. However, this can only happen if we labor together to create alternative narratives of early childhood education. It is hoped that this series supports each of us in considering how to reimagine curriculum as form making that is always responsive to the conditions of our time. The Early Childhood Pedagogy series, led by the Early Childhood Pedagogy Network pedagogists, invites all of us to think deeply about pedagogy and curriculum. I would like to honor our partners in these series, the Early Childhood Educators of British Columbia and the Child Care Resource and Referral Agencies of BC. I would also like to honor our funder, the Ministry for Children and Family Development. This sequence is the second series of conversations and is composed of two sequential conversations. The first series of sequence of conversations with Dr. Cristina Delgado Vintimilla, who was joined in the third conversation by Sarah Sutherland, focused on living pedagogies. This second series is composed of two sequential conversations on the relationship between pedagogy and curriculum. And as I mentioned earlier, PD certificates will be issued to all participants who attend both sessions. Before we meet our esteemed guests and my very dear friends and colleagues, atelierista Dr. Sylvia Kind and pedagogista Dr. Cristina Delgado Vintimilla, I would like to introduce the two pedagogists working with the ECPN who will lead this second series of conversations. Amy Andress is working in the Abbotsford Child Care Resource and Referral. She completed her early childhood education in Ontario, where she worked in various roles and organizations. When her family relocated to BC in the fall of 2019, She joined us and began her journey to become a pedagogist with the ECPN. She embraces the complex thinking opportunities offered by the ECPN while looking forward to getting to know better early childhood education in British Columbia. I would also like to introduce Jiyeon Kim, who is a CCR stream pedagogist working in Surrey and Delta. She completed her early childhood education degree with us at Capilano University and is now currently pursuing a master's degree in curriculum instruction at Simon Fraser University. She is looking forward to listening to multiple voices to think about how to create inclusive pedagogical spaces. I now turn the evening over to Jiyeon and Amy.
Thank you, Kathleen, for this very thoughtful introduction. Amy and I are very grateful to be part of this series, and I'm humbled to be speaking to you from the traditional unceded territories of the Semiahmoo, Katsi, Kwet'kwâlem, Kwantlen, Kikite, and Tsawwassen First Nations to reconnect with Sylvia and Cristina, as I had the pleasure of studying and thinking alongside both of them as my professors at Capilano University when I was completing my undergrad studies. I would like to formally introduce atelierista Dr. Sylvia Kind and pedagogista Dr. Cristina Delgado Vintimilla by sharing a small piece of their generative works that still resonates with me, which they will be expanding on throughout the series. Sylvia and Christina's different processes continually reminds me to engage with the idea of what it means to be an educator. The way I saw them approach curriculum as an atelierista and pedagogista imposed unique ways of being. For Sylvia, it was how to think about materials not as simply creating an activity or a topic, but to really see and experience materials as more than static objects. She shared with us that her motivation stems from an interest in young children's studio practices, their lively improvisations and collective experimentations, and developing understandings of studio research in early childhood context. Stephanie Bunn's an artist, and she often quotes her, and it still lingers with me to this day, which is to think of the action of making as working with a material rather than doing something to. For Cristina, was what it means to think about pedagogy always in relation to with ethics. She continually provoked me to think about what it means to pedagogically live well with others and to create space to pause and question pre-existing knowledge and not to get caught up in the technocratic attitude towards education. She shared with us that she engages with questions by problematizing issues of subjectivity in relation to prescribed practices in education, and by unsettling pedagogies that are based in human supremacy and instrumental managerial logics. A provocation from Cristina that I continue to think with while becoming a pedagogist is, who is the educator allowed to be within the collective, and who is the child allowed to be? Although Sylvia and Christina's approaches to curriculum stem from very different situated educational contexts, they both share with us that they think about curriculum processes that activate and formalize subjective and collective experiences. And through their many years of relationship and partnership together, their collective work creates a space for an ethical project of cultural creation at the intersection of aesthetics and pedagogy.
Thank you so much, Jiyeon, for those intimate introductions and weaving in how your past encounters continue to shape your becoming pedagogist. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional and unceded territories of the Katsi First Nations and Coast Salish people's land that I have the privilege of speaking to you from this evening. Jiyeon and I are honored to be navigating this conversation that emerged from our fellow pedagogists, Samantha and Courtney's conversations back in June, when they went to speak about curriculum making, in which Cristina directed our attention to the work of Sylvia Kind, and Cristina said, oh, we need Sylvia Kind for that. So this invitation to think with the idea of curriculum making with Sylvia and Cristina opened up our curiosities as pedagogists to think about what becomes possible when the work of an atelierista and pedagogista intersect. As Jiyeon and I are becoming pedagogists, we're excited to deepen our thinking further with Sylvia and Cristina. as they offer possibilities for new pathways of thinking that will come from this conversation through their sharing of their decade-long collaborative work together. We also hope that all of you attending this conversation tonight and Thursday will attune your thinking to the profound question of, what does it mean to think curriculum as a form of making? Which I know is definitely a lot to unpack, and we should also note that it's an original concept that directly links to the pedagogical and creative work at Capilano University Children's Center. But first, we want to recognize that CapU Children's Center is quite unique in contrast to current Western early childhood education centers we typically see in Canada. So if you do have any questions or comments, please add them to the chat throughout the conversation. And we know that Sylvia has thoughtfully prepared some images to share with us tonight, which will visually give us a sense of their initial work together, which she will be sharing on her screen. And we ask that you please do not record or take photos. And I know Sylvia and Cristina, you will likely speak more to this as well, but please know that they're not using these as a how-to or to be replicated. Rather, these are their tracings to illustrate for us their curiosities of what an encounter with this artwork could be like and how it could be a creative agent of change. So with that in mind, we would like to invite you, Sylvia and Cristina, to share with us a bit of your history and how you initially came to work together as an atelierista and pedagogista.
Thank you. Well, I think that with Sylvia, we thought that I will start, whatever that looks like, and then Sylvia will...
And it makes sense. You started at CAP before I got there. You were there a year before I was.
Yes, you're right. So we are going to follow that lineage of the historicity. And of course, I want to, as maybe many of you already in some ways know me, and for those of you that were in the other session, in the ECPN session, I can't start unless I share publicly some gratitude. And of course I need to start by being very grateful for being able to walk today through the lands of the Salish people, and with my children feel the blessings of the west wind in my face. I don't take that for granted, and I truly feel very fortunate for being able to do that. And in that line of gratitude, anyone and any situation that might bring me together to think with Sylvia and to share the more than a decade work that we have created, it is always something to be very grateful. So I'm very grateful for ECPN, for bringing us together, for hearing my multiple comments of, well, I need Sylvia to think about this and that and that. And I keep saying that constantly. So I hope that that is what keeps happening, that, you know, that I have to continue the path in thinking with Sylvia, even if geographically we are a bit far in these days because of the move to Toronto. And I think that there is also with gratitude and in gratitude that we can start sharing some of the history. We started working together thanks to the courage of a group of formidable women that were the group of women that formed the Department of Early Childhood Education for many years before we arrived at Capilano University. And it was very much the passion that they had for imagining early childhood in a different way. And I think that it was Lois Rennie at the time that she was a coordinator that went with the first group of people that traveled to Reggio Emilia and visit the Reggio Emilia experience. And when she came back, of what I am told, she says, that's it. We're going to try to be very inspired by this approach. And then Capilano took this very seriously, you know, to building a center that will reflect some of those inspirations, and to thinking within the faculty about how will they educate future early childhood educators, inspired by those ideas that had become such an inspiration for her, such an event. And of course, the lineage of this formidable woman continued when I met Capilano. Jen Moses was there as a coordinator. And after Jen Moses, I had the privilege to work with Kathleen Kummen, who I think deepened and intensified the vision that Capilano had for what was possible for early childhood education. And she has been always such a faithful, how can I say it, and truthful companion of this adventure. And by faithful and truthful, I don't mean always easy. And Katrina, I know you're laughing right now, but I really want to from the start share with you that everything that we will share today has nothing of romantic in it, or of easy, or of a smooth path. Yes, that was a group of formidable women that actually put out a call for a pedagogista. They actually were looking for a pedagogista fully on, not a pedagogical coordinator, not a halfway. They put it in international journals and looking for this pedagogista that they wanted to work with. And again, in the vein of gratitude, I will always be grateful to Lori Cocker, who at the time still faxes existed, and Lori faxed me the job posting, and that's how I came to Capilano, through that job interview. They posted for a pedagogista because of their inspirations in Reggio Emilia, and I know that they won't be upset with me saying they had no clue what it meant to work with a pedagogista. And that was one of the first difficulties, wanting something, perhaps thinking that it will look in a particular way, but actually ending up and being in a different way, and perhaps in a more challenging way than what they expected. And it was in that process of having me as a pedagogista that then Sylvia joined as an atelierista, as a faculty, not an atelierista, with of course all her background in art education and as an artist. And it was thanks to the birth of my child, Julian. We always inaugurate this with Julian, where we had to think about my maternity leave, that I proposed, and I think that the proposal was very, very echoed by previous, wishes and desires to have an atelierista. What if we give this year to Sylvia so that the center could have the experience of an atelierista? And after that year, we made everything so that Sylvia will never leave again. And divided my hours, my pedagogist hours to half, and that half went to Sylvia. And so that is very much, if you want, the nutshell of our coming together. But coming together, and with Sylvia, we always like to honor and to make clear that we came together because of an inspiration. And that inspiration was Reggio Emilia, the pedagogical approach of Reggio Emilia. That is not what Capilano is today.
No, but and I will just interrupt here for a second, Cristina, and I just want to reiterate, like, the history is no small thing. It was the courage of these women, the courage of the early department in making these choices, that this work didn't start with Cristina and me, but it really started with some of those decisions. And those early decisions, we are still reaping the benefits of it. But it's no easy thing to stay with it, to not get subsumed by the conventional early childhood or what we think it should look like, but still stay in the space of innovation.
Mm-hmm. And you might wonder, why is it that we keep going around this sort of source and gratitude? Is because for both of us matters a lot that we acknowledge the history that brought us together and the history that allowed for the work. We are not presentists. We actually have great concerns with the kind of presentist impetus that early childhood education often has, as if there was never a past, as if there is only what we have today. But that past matters a lot.
So Sylvia, yeah, we know that you prepared some of the photos that you would like to share with.
Yeah, not just yet. We need to just narrate a little bit of our first. Some of the, like, I think Cristina could probably, because she was at the center first, give a bit of a sense of what we were coming to with in the center and what we were trying to do. I came certainly as an atelierista, not knowing at all what an atelierista in Canada or at this site could actually look like. So it has always been an inventive position alongside Cristina. Like, I am formed as an atelierista in response so much to Cristina and to what was going on in the center.
Yes, and the same thing is valid for me. I also want to clarify that I speak as a pedagogista, and speaking as a pedagogista doesn't mean that is the equal to a pedagogist. And I think that is an important thing to distinguish for the public. But as in the tradition of a pedagogista, we are always becoming in relationship to the encounters and the place where we work. So the work of the pedagogist at Capilano Children's Center is intimately in response and enmeshed in Sylvia as an atelierista, and of course the history that we just spoke and the people that I encountered there. But I think that when the work started at Capilano, what was important to say is that we started with this Reggio Emilia inspiration, and you will come to Capilano. And I remember the first time that I entered Capilano, I said, oh my gosh, look, they did it, right? You enter Capilano with this sense of they arrived, almost if there was a place to arrive. If you are looking for some kind of similitudes to Reggio Emilia as a pedagogical approach. And the first time that one enters to Capilano, you can see immediately the aesthetic is speaking, and the aesthetics was speaking about the aesthetics of Reggio Emilia. And you could see that some of the senses of that inspiration existed there. But once we started the pedagogical work, that inspiration was there more perhaps in the environment than actually in the work being done, pedagogically or curricularly. So the first years, it was very much about trying to pay attention and to shade light and bringing to the table conversations around what I was talking when I was with you in the first session in ECPN, what I call these autoimmune logics, all those logics of protection that doesn't actually allow us to engage with any, I will say, pedagogical inspiration. So just to give you, because of the sake of time, I can't tell you everything, but the first years at Capilano really characterized about, it was about thinking, what are the discourses that are really present here? What are the discourses that when you walk and you see it, they seem that they are not here, but if you scratch a little bit or if you stay longer, you will see that they are present. And of course, child development was deeply present and deeply rooted at Capilano. Child development then was always present in the rules. I always like to say, and I think that the teachers will be okay with me saying, when we start making even mathematically a counting of how many rules Capilano had at the time that I arrived, we counted even to 120 rules that existed for the children. So the managerial logics, the developmental appropriate practices were deeply ingrained in the paradox of this beautiful environment, this environment that was trying to emulate Reggio Emilia. And that paradox, rather than being a problem for me as a pedagogista, was the very heart, the very tension that I wanted to work. And when Sylvia joined and we were working together in the center, I wanted to pick up something of that tension. I wanted to intensify the tension, not to make it better, not to make it easier, but to intensify so that we could have the conditions for perhaps an event. And when I say an event, I mean something that disrupts in such a way that something new might happen. And I was really interested in wanting to disrupt very much the logics of boundaries. Capilano was bounded by child development. Children that were infants needed to be in the infant room, and toddlers in the toddlers, and so forth, even if the center, architectonically speaking, was created with doors that open between the rooms, but those doors were never open. So you see the paradox I'm talking here. You can have the most beautiful environment, but you need to think about the logics that you're working pedagogically. And you need to notice that paradox as a space of tension and generativity. So I really, we're trying for a long time to undo those boundaries. And we're also boundaries that were created between, for example, the children and the teachers. If the child did something, we don't touch what the child did. But also boundaries between the teachers. If you are working in that project, I can't work. You know, these protectionist boundaries, this is my project, those are my children. It was a lot of these nuances that make a world, as I said before in ECPN, and a particular world that I wanted to disrupt. Because as a pedagogista, I am always oriented toward a future, and hopefully a livable future, a future that brings something new, but not just new for the sake of newness, something that can allow us to be otherwise, to experiment with more ethical ways of being. And so that was the event that we would like to share a little bit more, because I knew as a pedagogista in my training that encountering an atelierista and creating that intersection could be extremely powerful. And this event that we would like to share with you was very much the inauguration of that intersection, of actually, for me as a pedagogist, I was finally seeing something at play that was beyond the books I had read. Now I had actually my atelierista, and now I actually was able to experiment. And that's why the day that we experiment this event, or what happened and became an event, I had my heart in my throat, because of how vulnerable I felt, because I knew that we were flirting with something very powerful, if done in the way that I knew it could be done, in that intersection between pedagogy and the arts. And that is where I think Sylvia would like to share, and I will intersect to what she will share.
I would love to pause there for a minute, actually, Sylvia. And thank you so much, Cristina, for sharing how you entered in and all your insights of your thoughts coming in as a pedagogista. And I would love to hear a bit about Sylvia, and what did you think coming into this role with your background, and then coming into a role of an atelierista? I would just like to hear a bit of that history and what your thoughts were about coming into that role.
Well, I will tell a little bit of what I came in with when I start showing the images there, because I want to trace the story back a little bit. I started out as an atelierista, certainly having been to Reggio, read things, had a sense of who an atelierista was in Italy for sure. But first coming to the center, I thought this work is impossible. There was so much individual work going on. I thought couldn't do this work at all without a sense of the collective, without a sense of thinking together, being together. I had come to this outside of early childhood. I mean, my early studies were with Montessori. I taught Montessori for a few years, but this was my first entry back into early childhood. And quite honestly, had I known more about early childhood, I would have been far more cautious about what we did, Cristina. I probably wouldn't have done it. Had I been more aware of some of the discourses and the struggles and the context. And so it was, so I will, please come back to those questions if I don't answer them, Amy, but I'm going to share my screen and just start telling a bit of a story here. So I came as an artist, first of all, as an artist, certainly as a, an educator, I didn't know who I was yet as an early childhood educator. I don't know that I've ever necessarily defined myself in that way. But I came with a strong history or a strong context in artography, in art practice as research. That is actually how I've always read Reggio Emilia, is through that lens of seeing things, seeing the work of the atelierista as an artography work, in terms of seeing the art practices as forms of research. So thinking in and through processes, not having an idea and then simply reproducing it. But here, this is some of my early work, is thinking with stone, with water, with wool, in intersection with place, work that is situational, that is site specific, but isn't limited to a site, but it matters in terms of the place. So coming at this not from an early childhood orientation to the arts, but rooted in artistic practice and art practice as research and in contemporary arts. So seeing an artwork not as what we most typically think about in early childhood as process and product, as if in education we value one over the other, as if the product matters and the teacher tells, you know, everybody what to do, or conversely, thinking about art only as process, that the product doesn't matter, as if we separate the two things, but rather thinking about what is in the making, in the doing, in the artwork, not that it gets finished when the artwork is finished. And artwork, actually, most contemporary artworks are never quite finished. They're always intended to do something, to produce something, to work in a particular way. So an artwork is not just a finished product, it is the work of the arts. It's the work of the piece, what it does, what it sets in motion. And so that in my own, so I came with this stream being rooted deeply in the arts, in the creation, in the making of things, but not in a process product kind of way, but what is produced, big questions of what is produced in the making, in the doing, in the encountering, in the intersections. And this piece was a piece that I had in the Richmond Art Gallery at Gallery Gachet, a solo and a group exhibit. This was part of my dissertation research here. But it was located in the arts outside of early childhood. In Ellen Disaniaki, who's a cultural anthropologist, writes about how the arts put us in touch with important life concerns of the giving, the finding, and the receiving of love, of life and loss and death, of things that matter to us. And Elliot Eisner writes about how the work of the arts is not just in producing particular works, but in creating a culture, in creating a life together. So my rootedness in the arts has always been in that, not in education in the arts, but in what is produced, what is made, what kind of a life, what kinds of ways of thinking, of being, of perceiving are made visible and made evident through the arts. Whoops, sorry, my keynotes were. So this was the work in the Richmond Art Gallery here. And so what Christina came to me and she said, you know, I would like to, Christina said this much more dramatically than I will say. Would like to disrupt, would like to interrupt, would like to do something like an intervention, to intervene, to disrupt something, to shift the boundaries in the center. And so I propose this is, what if we take these more than 1,000 felted pods, take them and create an installation through the Children's Center. In a sense, some of my questions were really, you know, what is possible? What would the arts do in this, through this installation? What would it disrupt? What would it set in motion? What would happen if we created this? So we created this long line of pods through the infant room, through the dogwood room, out into the deck, a trail of pods going from the felted pods covered with stones onto the deck, this long, beautiful trail. I thought beautifully inviting, soft, warm, welcoming. And Christina, please interrupt at any point. So this was the initial installation, and children started to come in the morning. And we had told the teachers that we were going to create a surprise for them. So this was the surprise.
And I think that is a very important point to highlight, because we were trying to disrupt that sense of possession the teachers had of the rooms, we wanted to purposely do this surprise, this thing that they will arrive and something will be in the room. And teachers found that extremely intrusive, which for me was fascinating to think how much we were outsiders for them, that doing this was also our, us being very intrusive, as they told us. And you can see the door that is open is the door that goes to the deck in the children's center from the toddler room. But just where the pods start, there is another door which is to the infant room, and those doors were open. As you can see here, infants coming into the toddlers playing and mixing now the cars with the pods, which at the time at Capilano, this was something very difficult to perceive and to be with, because Capilano at the time, even if I had been working already for a year and a little bit more, 2 years actually, was still so connected to developmental appropriate practices. And developmental appropriate practices, one of the things that tells us is that a room is divided in corners. That doesn't exist for Capilano for many, many, many years. I feel so proud of saying these words. But these connections that you see, these cars and the children, for example, crawling in the floor, the toddlers and the cars being mixed up with the pods, was all a very new adventure.
Yeah, so the installation started quite beautifully. Beautiful trail of soft pods, and then the children started coming in and they went everywhere. And children started inventing games and putting them on their little hands and feet and covering things with them and throwing them, and soon they spread everywhere. And there was this sense of undoing, and many of the teachers, I could see some were involved in there and many stood back. It was as if you didn't know how to engage. What brought, I think what the event brought up as well were, at least for me, were so many of the not just the tensions, but the assumptions that were the starting points for curriculum, in terms of curriculum is where you follow a child's interest, that you build on what the child is doing, extend it, for instance. But if you don't have a sense of what children are doing or what this is about, or what, how is this artistic, or how is this an act of, of creating a curriculum together or something, there was a great deal of hesitancy in terms of what are we entering into? And so, and also the sense of hands off, of just watch the children rather than actually engage in. And so the pods were spread. What I began to do was move in there and begin to rearrange, create these circular, seeing children jumping, and so creating these circular spaces for children to jump into or to engage with, but to reposition the pods to be constantly in the making, and again, what to me was some of the starting points at the center was also very typical North American Reggio inspiration of thinking that you put a provocation out, then you stand back and watch and see what children are going to do, as if they'll do something amazing, and then you just watch. Instead of the making of a work doesn't end with the product. It doesn't end with these pods. We're always in the making, always in the recomposing and in the reconfiguring. So I would go in, reconfigure, repropose, replace, but be working with the pods at the same time that the children were working with it.
And Cristina, this reminds me, now I'm so curious to know more about the tension you were talking about, and the process that were not really easy to go forward. And when you mentioned that there's always some educators are so intrusive, but some are more involved than others, but there is still that friction and tension that still exists in the classroom. And I'm wondering and that reminds me of that hospitable tension that you both mentioned about, and in the preparation for the series, we talked about that tension as well. So I'm wondering if why is it so important to even recognize that there's a tension, and like why this friction is so important in the making of curriculum together as an atelierista and pedagogista as well.
I think that, your question, Jiyeon, is very important in the sense that if we stop for a second and take a bird view of what we were doing, we were trying to really disrupt a very big colonial legacy that we have in early childhood education, which is the concept and the reality, the materiality of mastering, of wanting to be always in control and to want to master a situation. When you think about attention, usually tensions are the things that we want to domesticate, pacify, smooth down. For me, when I used to talk in the center about working with the tensions, that was a very unfamiliar notion, but it was also a notion that was perceived almost as a problem, as even a threat, right? But why attention is perceived as a threat is because if you work with it, if you truly embrace attention, you need to let go some of the mastery that happens around. So for example, in the work of a pedagogista and an atelierista, that work can't be an echo of each other. It has to be a work of tension, but it has to be a work not only that the intersection is of tension, but it is looking for these generative tensions, because that is what, in some ways, if you want, the pedagogical work and the artistic work wants. They want to find where is the rub against, where is the friction that can create something. And often in early childhood education, what we do when these situations happen is what happened when we did the pods. Some engage, some went and hide. As teachers, as early childhood educator teachers, we are fantastic at saying that we are super busy. But saying that we are super busy is a way of hiding of the very tensions that a room might have that might be a great possibility to work pedagogically. And actually, this photo is reminding me that as the pods were happening, many teachers took this position of nothing is happening here. We can still be reading a book while all these problems around us are happening. Later in the years, like I think 4 years ago, we wrote a whole documentation on problems, on how, and if I think about from the pods to that documentation on problems, 10 years had passed. And here we were writing about how problems, being a problem, was the very generative place to be. But to respond to your question also, Jiyeon, I would like to bring people's attention is some of the words that Sylvia is using. This started with a what if. This did not start with Sylvia and I saying, we know what we are going to do here. It started with a big what if, which is what characterizes that intersection between Sylvia as an atelierista and me as a pedagogista work. But it also, we did this without knowing. We propose this on the basis of not knowing. So I'm just bringing your attention to this so that you can see how we were truly disrupting mastery on the basis of not knowing, on the thinking about what if, but even perhaps more importantly, we wanted to be catalysts and we wanted to create a catalyzing event, something that will produce something else. And this is the very incredible thing about pedagogy, without having any guarantee of what that something else will be.
Yeah, it could have absolutely fallen apart. I mean, and it probably did from some people's perspective. It could have been utter collapse and an utter disaster. So that of course is the risk always, having an intention. It's not doing something and not knowing anything. It's having an intention, having an idea, enacting something, but not knowing the consequences and not knowing what will be put in motion. I mean, so it was a significant disrupting moment, an opening moment, but it didn't solve things. It wasn't an event that said now things will be different after this. What for me it brought in was the opportunity to think about other languages of the arts. So rather than process and product and creating something or following a child's lead, is thinking more more about what about the ephemeral, what about the transitory, what about memory, what about trace, what about configurations, what about the making and the unmaking, the doing and the undoing, what about other kinds of languages. So it opened a space to think differently, but it didn't in any way solve anything. So it wasn't an event that fixed things. It was an event that opened the spaces, and we can begin to see more clearly what were some of the things that we were working with.
So a lot of the work of the tension between the pedagogista and the atelierista is the work of investigating into the unthinkable. That is what moved us. Not always, you know, very often we have to let that go, but this was an unthinkable moment. And again, bringing back to this question of the troubling of mastery.
Right. What about Cristina and Sylvia? When you notice the disruption in a bit of friction amongst educators, like how were you responding to those moments?
Yes.
You could speak to that. Yeah.
That's a great question, because, you know, it might be almost against common sense to say, how could you do this as a pedagogista knowing that you were going to, let's say, be in trouble with the teachers, you know, in some ways. I was, we were, you know, why would you do this? Because, you know, you want the teachers to like you. That could be one thing that we could think about. And of course, it was always taking a risk of not being likable. That is a risk that I think anyone that calls pedagogista herself will take the risk. But I think that it was the question of knowing that we were opening up something so that we then collectively could come together and think about that situation. That this was not a situation done by these two authorities that came down through, you know, who knows how, and imposed something on the teachers. I wanted to truly, with Sylvia, create this space where the sense of possession was so undone that we could come to the table with that undoing, with that feeling of, what did you do here? How could you come to my classroom? Or as a teacher told me in a very powerful way, I knew you were coming, I knew you were doing something with Sylvia, but I can deal only with the unexpected that I can expect. For me, that is a brilliant moment that in a nutshell tells us a lot about early childhood education. And I wanted to be in those moments, and never as I am creating this moment so that I can feel more, you know, expert, or I can show you how wrong you have been doing. But it was, how do we create a moment so that we can come together and really think about something together? We can come broken, undone, as the pots created these little felted things made of just wool, made this huge mess. Now what do we do? What has this moment given us to think? And it gave us for years to come. And also, just to say, remember that as a pedagogista, I am not a mentor. My role is not necessarily, and I think even less for Sylvia as an artist or an atelierista. The mentor takes care of the sort of self. That is not my role as a pedagogista. My role as a pedagogista was to create the conditions for pedagogical work, which is always collective work.
Yeah, and in that way, we, again, as pedagogista and atelierista, we have different streams of thought. We intersect, we connect, but we're not, you know, we don't work as necessarily supports for each other, where I'm supporting Christina's work and she was supporting mine. It's these streams of thought coming together to intersect to produce something. So while Cristina had pedagogical you know, intentions here, and I probably had very little, you know, most of my intentions grew out of this in terms of seeing what was at play and the limitation in the language that we had to talk about the arts. And so it was incredibly generative for me into disrupting this sense of individualism, this sense of following a child, the sense of project work where you have, you generate theories and then you work with those theories. And the limitations of art from an instrumental point of view, that we make something for something, or make something to show something, or make something so that it shows what a child is thinking about, instead of how do we immerse ourselves in these artistic contexts, in these situations, and can we develop a new language? And so that was one of the biggest things for me in terms of realizing the limitations of the language even. And so after that, we began looking at a different contemporary artists' work and trying to get a bit more of a sense of what is artistic practice outside of early childhood. So it isn't only governed by what children are doing and the limitations of education, but it fits within the whole context of contemporary arts and artistic practice. And so we can begin to elaborate and expand on the kind of language that we use and the way of understanding and engaging in the arts. But it didn't fix anything. It just made open spaces to begin to talk about some of these things.
And if I can say one more thing connecting to along the lines of what Sylvia is talking in terms of instrumentalization and really resisting that, I was asked often at Capilano at the beginning, and not by the educators, very much by people outside the work with the educators, shouldn't you be working more at their level? This idea, and I'm sure people that are listening know what I'm talking about, this idea that we should work at the educators level, which to me was always shocking to hear that, because I hear also a sort of a patronizing feeling there or sense. But let's forget that and think about this idea of working at the educators level and the expectation that as a pedagogista or as an atelierista, we should be doing that. This was exactly the opposite of that. Mm-hmm. There was no working at their level. And the amount of generative impulse and what my professors in Italy will call pedagogical energy, and I would say artistical energy, that this brought to the life in the center, it was on and on and alive for years. So I think that, and I remember hearing in the work I have done in Ontario often, we need to be engaging with things that we can understand, that we can grasp, that we can perceive as familiar. But I really want to highlight how unfamiliar this was, and how the unfamiliar aspect of this brought a gift, the gift of thinking otherwise, which is, I think, that gift that the intersection between pedagogy and the arts will always bring.
And for us as well, like it was an incredible gift for me in terms of working with Cristina, working with the center, and beginning to see something generated from this as an event. And what made, as Cristina has mentioned, an event sets something in motion. It's not just something that happens. It produces something. It makes something possible. And yeah, we've been benefiting from this for years and years and years. But again, this isn't something that now everybody has to go off and do long trails of pods through their centers, but it is trying to figure out, what do you bring? What could possibly be set in motion that would disrupt, that would show you where the resistances are, that would open up spaces, that would show some of the tension so you can see what you're actually working with. So I guess, in part of the focus for tonight is thinking about curriculum as a form of making, but to me, one of the big questions is, what are we actually in the midst of? If we're making a life together, if we're making curriculum together, we also have to have a sense of, what are we in the midst of? What are we working with?
Yes, and what ours were too, I mean, this is also where the arts and pedagogy encounters in this idea of what is moving us, what is orienting us towards this work. Sylvia did not come to me and say, well, what should we do? And I didn't say to Sylvia, well, what do you feel like it? And Sylvia said, well, I feel like to bring in my pots. What do you think? And I said, yes, sure. It was nothing of the sort. It was very thoughtful in the sense of this is the situation that we are encountering. These are the things that concerned us and concerns us pedagogically. These are the sort of autoimmune logics that are at play. How could we respond? And it's always a matter of responding without asserting power, without responding so that I know better, so that I know what will be a best way to do. We are far from that kind of transcendentalisms, that kind of bringing the beyond. It is extremely immanent, is in the here, in the now, in the responding to what is emerging, but responding following a particular pedagogical orientation that wants to perish, not a pedagogical orientation that wants to impose and be identified like a model or an approach. And often we think that we are doing pedagogy when we are applying an approach. We are far from pedagogy if we are doing that.
Thank you so much for sharing such a fascinating event. And if we can just touch more on the opening up of these possibilities, and I guess get a little bit more clarification on how that generates the curriculum making. And I know that, Cristina, you've talked in our previous conversations in preparation for the series about how Sylvia is able to puncture traditional ways. And maybe if you could speak a little bit to that as well, kind of a twofold.
Yes, and actually, because I can say so much that I need to know how much time we have left.
We have approximately 15 more minutes before we proceed to questions. So,
one thing, and please, Sylvia, jump in, but I think that there are two things I would like to highlight to answer your question, Amy, that we have been saying. One, and I don't know how much people notice because Sylvia said it in just a passing, but there is something that characterizes very much the work at Capilano Children's Center, a work that today we call it West Coast Pedagogies. And that work was inaugurated by this encounter of an atelierista and a pedagogista. Both of us are not of early childhood education. Sylvia, as she shared with you, she does not come from early childhood education. She came from a particular background in the arts and in art education with particular orientations there. And I am a pedagogista in Italian tradition, and that is not a pedagogista in early childhood education. Far from it. I came to early childhood almost by accident, really, in many ways. And I have never been of it, and I don't want to be of it. I want to be always at the edges of it. And I keep telling this to my dear friends in early childhood with whom I work. So I think that the first thing I would say, Amy, what Sylvia, these generative moments that Sylvia produces and that is able to propose as a making of a curriculum can happen a lot because she's not thinking only within early childhood education. And I want to be very careful and clear here that I'm not dismissing early childhood education, but I am actually inviting early childhood to start imagining itself outside its boundaries, imagining itself in conversation with what is not, and thinking what happens. As Sylvia is saying, we are not sharing this. Hopefully no one will go and try to create white pots and put it around a room. But maybe what the invitation here is to start thinking with this question, what happens when we think early childhood education outside of it? And I think that is what Sylvia has given us in the thinking of this curriculum making. In resisting too, I at least what I see in Sylvia is always resisting this idea of a generalization. Her work is highly situated. And because her work is so highly situated, so deeply rooted in the West Coast, that is one of the things that I have responded as a pedagogista in the most intense way I could. And I remember coming to Sylvia and saying, look, we have to deeply in this question that you have brought to us of being in conversation with this place and with the notion of a situation. And that's why at Capilano Children's Center, when we think about curriculum making, we take great inspiration in the concept of a situation, and particularly in the situationists from the 60s and the 70s that today we don't have the time to talk about. But the reason why we went there is because of Sylvia. And it's because of my response of trying to find a way to work with her. And to work with her, not because this is about how we get along, but because in the response we are creating something. It has never been about me or Sylvia. It is never about one. It is always about this bigger story that we are weaving, but in response to what we bring. So it's not about us, but there is a Sylvia. There is a trajectory. There is someone that brought something. And the West Coast pedagogies emerged from that encounter with this particular artist, with her particular intentions and her particular sensitivities. And I guess with this particular pedagogista, with her, you know, stubbornness, you know, an accent and all that.
Yeah. And to add to that is also an idea of what it means to make something, which again, I think it's important to step outside of early childhood, outside of the arts within early childhood, and think a bit differently about these acts of making, that it's not about having an idea and then implementing it somehow, or working with materials or working with curriculum and then doing it as if it's implementing an already formed idea. But it is, so, and I think so much of this is illustrated in this PODS movement. It's the idea that in the making, we're always working with something in perpetual movement. It's not about what the work is. It's not about what these stones, what the pods were, what they meant, what they represented, because they didn't actually necessarily represent anything, but it's what it sets in motion, what it does, and how we engage with these motions, how we begin to work in correspondence, in movement, in choreography with the movements already at play. So it's an idea of making, and curriculum making is not just implementing an idea, but of engaging with things in the encounter with them. How are we changed by it? How do we respond? How do we play with, whoops, sorry, shouldn't be looking at that. Sorry, my computer is weird. But it's thinking about not interpretation, not representation necessarily, but the motions, the movements, what is being created in these acts of making. And these acts of making are taking place through these pods, through the intersection with them. It's not just putting out something finished and then engaging with it. So it's thinking about making in the arts as always, and in the, like, art is never finished. It is always in perpetual movement. It always is working somehow. So it's working with the workings of the arts.
Yes, and I think that one thing that is important also, if we start sort of moving our way into this concept of making, and why Sylvia and I decided to refer to curriculum as something that is a making of a form of making, it has to do with this notion. Oh, am I frozen? No. I thought no. I have some trauma of being frozen on Zoom. And now I lost my train of thought. Oh my gosh, what I was saying.
Making.
I think, yeah, and I think that's something that I was trying to touch on as well. I know we have to leave time for audience questions, but why are you committed to this particular form of curriculum making? Why does this orientation matter so much to you both?
Yes, and this is the thing I wanted to say, because you might think, okay, so then you just had an artistic experience. And that is fine, but that is not what we only want if you're saying that you are doing this in a pedagogical space. And I think that is the important piece. And it took us years for Sylvia and for me to figure out this. How do we encounter an aesthetic experience that is also a pedagogical experience? And when we think about curriculum making, when we think about these spots making something, it is also in resistance to something. As we were saying before, it was trying to disrupt something, but it was also resisting to important points for Sylvia artistically and for me pedagogically, resisting to the idea that curriculum is there to entertain children. Often teachers tell us that the child is bored. We need to put the sandbox because that calms them down. So a kind of entertaining or almost behavioral situation. Or the children will have a multiplicity of activities. They will go around the activities and off we will move to the next transition in the day. And so we have our playtime and then our nap time and so forth, right? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have transitions, but I'm really trying to shed light that this is not just about let's put some art out there. It is also trying to rethink curriculum and resist curriculum as a kind of an entertainment, as I was saying, or as Sylvia has been saying, I think multiple times tonight, as just noticing what kind of meaning the children are making. And not that children's meaning making doesn't matter, it matters, but that can't be the full focus of pedagogy. And by this, I am not saying that then the opposite is to now notice what a squirrel does and think about our encounters with the non-human. I'm not talking about that, which it's happening a lot in early childhood. Now we are not about meaning making, now we are about the squirrels and our encounters with them. No, we're talking about what kind of a field of experience are we cultivating here in the intersection between pedagogy and the arts, and in the name of what are we doing this? And there was a very particular question that moved us to create this notion of curriculum making, which, and I actually wanted to pull out from my notes and read it to you tonight, which was always thinking about what conditions of possibility we could create for alternative relational logics and modes of thinking. And I know that this can sound super, you know, what is she saying? Alternative relational logics and alternative modes of thinking. But that is what we were trying to put in motion in this curriculum making. In trying out something that we don't really know what it is, but we know that we want to take out the force of certain things. We want to subtract as much as we can the force of child development, the force of these kind of colonial capitalistic practices that are so present in early childhood education. Is Capilano free of them? Not at all. It's completely haunted. Capilano is a haunted space, in the way of the greatest of the hauntology that Derrida will talk. Child development is constantly there, but as something that perturbs, something that bothers, something that needs to be rethought again and again. So it's not how we create curriculum so that we can fix these problems, but it is how we can create a making of some sort that can allow us to perhaps imagine something alternative.
Yeah, and also imagining alternatives to what was so pronounced when I came to CAP, and it's still, you know, it's still in some of our language of practicum assignments. It's still within the, you know, the North American Reggio inspiration of an emergent curriculum where you just have an experience, put some provocations out. There's an experience and then you extend it. Then you have another experience, then you extend it. As if we never really know where we're going, but or it's this wandering from here to there to here to there, as if we're following a child's ideas, trying to make the child's ideas visible in a very surface kind of way. And so an idea of making opens that up to say we're actually not just following, we're not just extending, we're not just seeing and doing the next thing. It's what the idea of making that we're working with is a much more interesting and complex, where we're working with place, with history, histories, with resistances, with struggles, with tensions, with possibilities, with materials, with children, with educators, with time, with flows and rhythms of things, that this act, artistically, the acts of making are far more interesting and complex than what often gets put out in curriculum as the way that you just follow or let curriculum emerge. So it's to think more complexly and more interestingly, and from my perspective, more artistically in these, that making is an art, it's not only an artistic act, but it is also an artistic act of the way that something is made isn't just made to produce and made to, you know, something that's ended up. As an artwork, it is always in the making, always working. And so how do we create curriculum that is always working, always in the making, always, you know, working with these tangible and intangible and ephemeral and textural things and creating something together. And what we're creating is not just a topic or an understanding of something, it's creating a life together, a way of being, a way of thinking together.
And today we don't have much more time to say, but one thing I would want to leave you is that pedagogically in the work of thinking about this curriculum making, the key concept has been a concept that we borrowed from my Italian tradition, which is the idea of an ideation. Mm-hmm. And actually the idea of the ideation that is deeply embedded in the pedagogista work and in pedagogy in the Italian tradition, it is very dear to artists. They mm-hmm. also ideate, as the word says, putting an idea in action, following the moves of an idea, the movements of an idea, and composing ourselves and co-composing ourselves with an idea. These are two major concepts for us when we think about curriculum making. One is that of ideation, and the other is that of composing and composing ourselves with something, which we borrow from David Jardine, he borrows from hermeneutics. But I was just wanted to leave that as a perhaps for the next time we meet.
And we knew that all we could do today would be as sort of an introduction to some of these ideas.
I want to thank you, so very much. And you did more than an introduction. I think you've left us sort of hanging, ready to hear some more next time. And I guess I just wanted to bring forward some of the questions that arose during your conversation. One of the things, it was interesting that I really heard the word disruption multiple times. And one of the questions that the participants have asked is to speak about how does disruption live? Like, what do you mean by that? Because the question is, what is the rhythm for the child? Sleeping, eating, and how do disruptions live between those rhythms of children? So I'm wondering if you could just, answering that question, also just speak to that wonderful word disruption, because I think it provokes another thinking than you were perhaps going for.
I'll answer that briefly, and then Cristina, you probably have a longer answer. But I think for me, the disruption is always at the heart of studio work. It's always trying to interrupt, to disturb, to unsettle something. It might be an idea of what a bird is. It might be an idea of what a form of existence is. It might be something. It might be what drawing is. It might be what it means to be together. But I think at the heart of it, it is always to unsettle something. For me, as well as with the children and the ideas we're working with. So it's the heart of the work, I think.
Yeah, I think that's very much along the lines of Sylvia. This actually, what you make me think, Kathleen, with this question is something that has always puzzled me in my experience, and I'm trying not to create any generalization, but in my experience in the early childhood context in Canada, is this question of how it sort of tenses us, the idea of disrupting. And
yes,
the reason why it puzzles me is because we are awash in natality. What other space more than early childhood education to be awash in this natality that these children bring? And shouldn't be that the very space where we actually engage with the disruption?
Christina, would you mind explain a little bit more of the natality a little bit? I know there's not enough time. I just wanted to give the audience a little bit of sense of where that's coming from, if you don't mind.
Yes, of course. My gosh, now my Argentine friends are going to I can hear them in my mind. Well, you know, when I talk about natality, I am going back to Hannah Arendt and her notion of natality. But I don't think, yes, Hannah is one person, but there are other pedagogisti in the Italian tradition that have talked about this question of being awash in childhood as being awash in natality. And I don't have the time to make justice to the concept of natality, but natality in the sense of bringing something into the world. You know, something that is not necessarily of this world, and encountering, for me, early childhood at least, is that encounter between this bringing something into the world and encountering others that have been for longer in this world, not encountering the expert in child development that knows the stages that you will have to go through so that you are a successful human in the very white sort of background in which we exist, but really this encounter between someone that brings something new and me that have been here for longer. I'm not here to tell you how to live this life, but I'm here to tell you the story of this world. I think Hannah Arendt will invite us to consider that. You know, I'm not going to go beyond this, but that, to go back to this question, and you know, yes, the child sleeps and the child eats, but the child is constantly asking us, what more, you know, because the child is always saying, what else is disrupting? I mean, we want to talk about mastery being disrupted, just follow a child, but we don't necessarily want to do that. It's not easy. You know?
And this disruption concept has really caught our attention, because another question around disruption is, you know, as you identify the autoimmune logics, how do you decide what materials, what actions that you might take to disrupt? And are children and educators part of that thinking?
Yes. Yes, that's a fabulous, and I'm sure Sylvia has.
It would take a long time to address that one. How you decide the materials? Well, again, it's within, a material on its own does very little. So it's not just the material. It's not just what you do with children. It is how things work together and what can you put into play to intersect to produce something, to produce a possibility, not necessarily to produce something specific. But if we're thinking about being and becomings and hatchings and transformations and metamorphoses, then what are some materials that are going to keep this open and keep it fluid and keep us wrapped in these ideas, so we can inhabit, we can live in them, as well as disrupt conventional understandings of what it means to be and become and to hatch and to, you know, transform. So it's choosing materials that offer suggestions, that offer possibilities, but there's no one, like in the arts, any pathway is going to lead you somewhere. You just make a choice and you follow it. It's not as if there is a set material to use for this idea or for this process. It's just what will the materials, what will these processes do? How will they intersect, and what possibilities could, you know, and ways of being could these materials allow for? So clay, for instance, is stable and firm and dense and heavy. And so ideas like flight is not going to mesh well with clay, but certainly something more stable or moving between something ephemeral and something stable will work. But it's choosing materials that will allow for particular possibilities. I don't want to say material, you know, this material is used for this, because everything is conditional, everything is situational.
And also because you then take the risk to instrumentalize the material.
Exactly.
So then
Yeah.
we will make, let's do white and pink so that we feel calm. You know,
Yeah. Or if you're thinking about flight, you have to use this material. It isn't any, like, really it's, and I wish I remember who said this, but it could have been Elliot Eisner, basically saying that in the arts, every pathway leads you somewhere. Anything will get you somewhere. You just choose that pathway, and then it shapes your thinking, it shapes the ideas, it shapes what comes out. But it isn't a one-to-one correspondence, as if you're thinking about this, then you have to use this material.
Yet at the same time, it is important what materials configuration.
It's very important, absolutely. It matters incredibly.
But the way you think of it is not, I'm going to put this together so that then I will get these results. Because if you think, who will have said that white little felted pots will have caused such profound disruption?
Yes, yes.
You know, we are making it quite nice tonight. in not really bringing the rawness, you know, the great disruption that these little tiny things create when they were thousands and they were opening doors. And the other thing I want to say when thinking about that question is not just the material that matters, is the ideation and the material, is the encounter between the material and the idea that you want to activate, that you have not necessarily a guarantee of where you're going, but there is something that you're trying to think. So I often think, and I hear this a lot in this sort of translation of Reggio Emilia in the Canadian context, that now is all about the materials. But if you can have the most wonderful materials, and in fact, I know centers that have this situation, wonderful materials, but you don't have ideation. Where are you going?
Yeah. And it is this creating a situation. So it's in creating an event, a context, a space, it's not just held in the materials. Again, it's in the ideation, in and in the making of an idea, in the making of something together. It's not inherent in the materials.
Kathleen, what was the second part of that question?
Yeah. So the second part of the question was, where are the children and the educators? Are they involved in the creating of or the selection of the materials and creating provocations?
Yes. Yes. Well, I don't know.
First of all, I wouldn't create provocations. That I have trouble with that word, just because it suggests set things out, stand back and watch what happens. I would say create situations, create contexts, create events, exchanges, interactions, dialogues, ways of being together. But certainly as atelierista, I would compose the studio. But the children and the educators and the materials and the ideas and myself were all together in the making of curriculum, in the doing of it, in the enlivening of things, in the thinking, in the exchange. So it's not doing something for them, but certainly, yeah, does that answer the question? You're going to say something, Cristina.
Yes. And I would like actually to come back to this tomorrow because I think that there's a lot to say here. But what I would like to say is, look, the question of curriculum making is one of the most difficult things in my experience that educators at Capilano had to embrace. Because curriculum making requires to move away from the busyness of managerial logics. It requires to say, yes, changing a diaper is important, wiping faces is important, but the entire day can't be made of that. It really requires to move away from all those daily logics. Important, please, I want to highlight this because I don't want to be misunderstood. But curriculum making is saying, as an educator, that can't be all. And in fact, you know, with my dear colleague Fikile and Narda Nelson, Fikile Sumalo and Narda Nelson, we wrote a paper where my little contribution to the paper was to talk around this question of the early childhood educator as an adrift subject, like the logs in the Fraser River that go adrift, right? That we just go along the day. And in some ways, great ways, very efficient ways, a day is done. And you go home and you have done, and the children were safe and healthy and happy even. But curriculum making says that is really not even the start of a pedagogical and artistic or creative encounter. So where are the teachers? Where are the children? That is a great question, because it is a question that is inviting us to say, where, first, maybe before where are they, is who are they? How are they in the room? Can we even imagine an early childhood educator that is not just about, you know, the managerial, daily, here and there things that we do? Not that they don't matter, but they are not what makes a pedagogical life.
Mm-hmm. And I love how you keep going back to what makes a pedagogical life. And I know we don't have time for all of the questions, but we will come back to them, because I know Cristina and Sylvia, you're going to love them, because one of them talks about resisting entertainment, the resisting of composing moments to entertain children. And another question that's drawing us back to really thinking about how do we pay attention to tension as generative, you know, as part of curriculum making. So for those of you who did not hear your questions answered, I've got them. We're going to come together and we will answer those questions. So thank you very much for those of you who did put questions in. It was wonderful, and what a generative conversation. And Jiyeon and Amy, I think that you are going to end our evening.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for facilitating those questions for us, and a great big thank you and with much gratitude to Sylvia and Cristina for joining us in this conversation tonight. I know Jiyeon and I have taken many notes, and we're excited to review those together and also look at all of the wonderful comments and questions from the attendees tonight to see what has emerged from that conversation that we haven't gotten to see yet. So we look forward to continuing our conversation with both of you again Thursday evening. So yeah, we're very excited. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. It was a lovely and generative conversation. Wishing everyone a great day tomorrow, and looking forward to seeing everybody and continuing this conversation Thursday night. Thank you very much.